welcome. Tonight we sit with yin and yang, not as opposites at war, but as a single rhythm of rest and effort, dark and light, stillness and motion, each one completing the other rather than competing with it. Many of us carry a quiet guilt about resting, as though every still hour were a debt owed to tomorrow's effort. Taoism offers something gentler. Nothing moves well for long without also resting well. The night is not the interruption of the day. It is the day's other, necessary half. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you are a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers finding their way to rest. You do not need to know anything about Taoism to be here tonight. These teachings are for anyone who has ever pushed through exhaustion or felt that resting was somehow wasted time. Tonight, you will meet a falconer, a drummer, a dancer, a singer, and others, each one refusing to let anything pause, each one slowly shown a quieter way. So wherever you are right now, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Let us begin. In Taoist thought, yin and yang are not two armies facing each other across a battlefield. They are two halves of one circle, each curving into the other. Yang is the bright, active, rising force, the hawk in flight, the moon sun, the outward reach. Yin is the dark, receptive, settling force, the nest, the dusk, the inward fold. Neither is greater. Neither could exist without the other. A bird that only flies will eventually forget how to fly. Mastery is not choosing one, it is trusting the turn between them. We tend to imagine progress as a straight line, climbing steadily upward without ever doubling back. But the hawk does not hunt that way, and neither does anything else alive for very long. It rises and it settles, it strains and it stills. The settling is not a pause in its progress. It is the part of its progress we simply forget to notice because it does not look like anything happening at all. Tonight's teaching begins simply. The wing that lifts and the wing that folds are not enemies. They are partners in the same flight. There was once a falconer who trained hunting birds for a wealthy household, and he was proud above all things of how little his birds rested. Other falconers let their hawks return to the perch after each flight, to mantle their wings, to close their eyes in the sun. This falconer believed that was waste. He kept his birds flying from dawn until the last light failed, certain that a bird kept always in motion would become the sharpest, swiftest hunter in the province. For a season, it seemed to work. His hawks caught more, faster than any others. Word spread. People came to watch them streak across the open fields, return into his glove again and again, never seeming to land for long. But late in that same season, an old falconer from a neighboring estate came to watch and stood quietly at the fence for a long while before speaking. "Your birds fly beautifully," the old man said. "They fly more than any others," the falconer answered, not quite hiding his pride. "While yours roost, mine hunt." The old man watched a hawk return, wings trembling slightly as it gripped the glove. He said nothing for a moment. "Watch the grip," he said at last. The falconer looked. The hawk's talons were not closing fully. Its feathers, usually sleek, looked rough at the edges, as though they had not been properly groomed in days. He had not noticed, busy as he was tallying each successful catch. "She's tired," the falconer said, surprised at himself for saying it. "She has been tired for some time," the old man said. "You simply hadn't looked." The falconer bristled. "She still catches everything I send her after." "For now," the old man said. "But tell me, when does she become herself again? Not the hunter, the bird. Did your own birds ever suffer for resting too much?" the falconer asked, somewhat defensively, hoping to find some flaw in the old man's method. "Never once," the old man said. "I have lost birds to illness, to age, to the ordinary dangers of the wild. I have never lost one to rest." The falconer had no answer. He had never thought of his hawks as anything but instruments of the hunt, tools to be kept sharp through continuous use. The idea that the bird needed time to simply be a bird, apart from any task, had never occurred to him. "She roosts at night," the falconer said, somewhat defensively. "Briefly," the old man said, "and then you have her in the air again before the light is fully up. Tell me, when you watch her hunt, what do you see?" "Speed," the falconer said, "precision. And when she roosts, really roosts, a full day, doing nothing at all." The falconer admitted he had never given any bird a full day of nothing. It felt, even to imagine it, like a kind of failure, a wasted day. A bird not working was a bird not earning her keep. The old man smiled faintly. "I rest my birds completely, 1 day in every 7. No flight, no glove, only the perch, the sun, the wind moving their feathers without asking anything of them. And they still hunt as well as mine." "Better," the old man said, "because a bird that rests fully knows in her body the difference between effort and exhaustion. Yours has forgotten there is a difference. She is always reaching for the same speed, whether she has it to give or not." "How can you tell the difference just by watching her fly?" the falconer asked, genuinely curious now. "A hawk reaching from strength moves like she enjoys the reaching," the old man said. "A hawk reaching from exhaustion moves like she is simply trying not to fall. From a distance they can look almost the same. Up close, the difference is unmistakable the moment you know to look for it." The falconer looked again at his hawk, at the slight tremor in her grip, the dullness at the edge of her feathers that he had mistaken, until now for nothing important. "I thought rest was the enemy of the hunt," he said quietly. "It is the other half of the hunt," the old man said. "The dive is yang, the stillness on the perch before it is yin. You cannot have the swift, certain strike without the long, unhurried waiting that comes before it. You have only been training half a hawk." The falconer did not answer right away. He thought of all the seasons he had measured his birds by motion alone, by how many hours they spent in the air, never once asking how many hours they spent simply existing, unburdened, becoming whole again. That evening, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not call his hawk back to the glove before dusk. He let her sit on her perch as the light faded, doing nothing at all, and he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not feel the day had been wasted. He gave her, the next morning, an entire day of rest. He did not know, watching her sit motionless in the early sun, whether it would change anything. But something in him had already begun to soften toward the idea that stillness, too, might be a kind of work, the kind that does not look like work at all. Strange, the falconer admitted to the old man that evening. I kept wanting to call her back to the glove just to feel useful again myself. That is the part most falconers never expect, the old man said. It is not only the bird that must learn to rest, it is the one watching her, who built his own worth around her constant motion. The falconer watched the next morning as his hawk lifted from the perch with a sharpness in her wings he had not seen in months, and something in his chest eased at the sight of it, some old tightness he had not known he was carrying. In Sufi poetry, there is a similar understanding of motion and stillness as one breath rather than two opposing states. The poet Rumi often wrote of the reed flute, cut from the reed bed and made to sing only because it had first been hollowed out, emptied, stilled, made silent before it could ever make music. The song depends entirely on the emptiness that came before it. Sufi poets also speak of the whirling that some practitioners use in devotion, the turning body held in motion around a center that itself never moves. The turning and the stillness are not two different things. The stillness at the center is what makes the turning possible at all, the same way the falconer's hawk needed her stillness to make her flight true. There is a saying attributed to the Sufi tradition that the bird does not sing because it has an answer, but because it has a song, and that song, too, requires its silences. Without the pause between phrases, even the most devoted singing collapses into noise. The hawk's stillness on the perch is its own kind of devotion, quiet and unseen before the next flight begins. You may recognize something of that falconer in your own life. Perhaps you have not taken a full day off in longer than you can name, certain that rest, like an unflown hawk, represents lost ground. Perhaps you feel a flicker of guilt watching something light on the television instead of finishing one more task, as though only visible effort counts as a life well spent. Consider tonight that your stillness is not the opposite of your effort. It is the other wing. Without it, every motion eventually grows ragged at the edges, the way the hawk's feathers grew rough from a rest too brief to do its work. Maybe you feel, like that falconer, that your own worth is tied to how visibly busy you appear to others, and that a full day spent doing nothing at all feels less like rest and more like disappearing. That fear is common, and it is also gently mistaken. The hawk did not become less herself by resting. She became more capable of being exactly what she already was. You do not need to solve this tonight, only feel it, the way the falconer finally felt the tremor in his hawk's grip, not as a thought, but as a quiet recognition in the body. And as you lie here now, let yourself be the bird returning to the perch at last, with nowhere left to fly tonight, and nothing left to prove before sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Music depends on silence as much as it depends on sound. Without the gap between notes, there is no rhythm at all, only an undifferentiated wall of noise. In Taoist thought, yang is the struck note, the sound that fills the air. Yin is the silence that follows, the space that lets the next note mean something. A song without rests is not a fuller song. It is no song at all. The space between beats is not empty. It is where the rhythm actually lives, the place where one sound becomes distinguishable from the next, where the listening mind can finally catch up to what it has heard. We often think that more is always more. More sound, more output, more visible motion. But a drum struck without pause does not become more musical. It becomes a single, undifferentiated wall of noise, indistinguishable from silence in its own way, because nothing in it stands apart from anything else. Tonight's teaching is simple. The silence is not a gap in the music, it is part of the music. There was a young drummer who trained under a master percussionist known for performances that could last an entire night without faltering. The young drummer believed the secret to this endurance must be a refusal to ever let the rhythm stop, even briefly, and so he practiced for hours at a stretch, striking his drum continuously, certain that any pause in his playing was a pause in his skill. When he was finally permitted to perform alongside his teacher at a village gathering, he played without a single rest, filling every possible beat with sound, proud of how unbroken his rhythm seemed. Afterward, the villagers thanked him politely, but it was his teacher's drumming, with its long, deliberate silences between phrases, that they spoke of long into the night. The young drummer found this difficult to accept. "I played more notes than you," he said to his teacher, trying to keep the frustration from his voice. "I never stopped." His teacher only smiled and set down his drum. "Tell me what you remember of my playing," he said. "The silences," the young drummer admitted, somewhat reluctantly. "They made me lean forward, waiting." "And what do you remember of your own playing?" The young drummer thought and found to his surprise that he could not recall much of it at all. It had simply blurred together, one beat following another without distinction, like rain that falls so steadily it stops sounding like individual drops. "Why does that happen?" he asked. "Because your ear, like everyone's ear, needs space to recognize what it has heard," his teacher said. "A beat without silence before it is not really a beat. It is only part of a continuous sound. The silence is what lets the beat arrive." The young drummer turned this over for a while. "But the gathering was for celebration," he said. "I thought the more I played, the more I gave them." "You gave them sound," his teacher said. "Sound is not the same as music. Music is the shape sound makes around silence. Without the silence, there is no shape at all, only noise." The young drummer considered his own performance again, the long, unbroken stretch of beats he had been so proud of. He realized, turning it over, that he had not once let the rhythm breathe. "How do you know when to leave the silence?" he asked. "How do you know how long it should last?" "I listen for what the rhythm is asking," his teacher said. "Sometimes a silence needs to be brief, like a held breath before a single sharp strike. Sometimes it needs to stretch, so the listeners feel the weight of what is coming. You cannot decide this in advance. You must feel it. The way you feel when a held breath has gone on just long enough. That sounds harder than simply playing, the young drummer said. It is harder, his teacher agreed. Playing without rest asks nothing of you but stamina. Playing with rest asks you to trust that the silence is doing work even while your hands are still. Many drummers cannot bear that trust. They fill every space out of fear that stillness will be mistaken for failure. Were you ever one of those drummers? The young man asked. For many years, his teacher admitted. I filled every space I could, terrified that an audience hearing silence would think I had nothing left to offer them. It took a long while, and many quiet failures, before I trusted that the silence could carry weight on its own. What changed your mind in the end? An old musician once told me that the audience does not come to hear how much sound I can produce, his teacher said. They come to feel something. And feeling, more often than not, needs room to happen in. I could not give them that room while I was busy filling every space with noise. That seems like a strange thing to learn from someone else, rather than from your own playing, the young drummer said. Most of the truest things I know, I learned from someone willing to say them plainly, his teacher said. I might have found my own way there eventually. It would have taken far longer and cost a great many more performances than I care to count. The young drummer asked his teacher to demonstrate again, and this time he listened differently. Not for the beats themselves, but for what happened in the spaces between them. He noticed for the first time how the silence seemed to gather tension, how the next beat, when it finally arrived, struck with far more weight for having been delayed. How did you finally stop being afraid of it? The young drummer asked his teacher. I am not certain I ever fully stopped, his teacher admitted. I simply began noticing more and more that the silences my audiences remembered longest were the ones I had been most afraid to leave in. Eventually the proof outweighed the fear, even if the fear itself never entirely left. I think I have been afraid of the silence, the young drummer admitted. Most are, his teacher said. It feels like emptiness. But emptiness and rest are not the same thing. Rest is full of what is coming next. It only looks empty from the outside. The young drummer asked to try again, and this time, instead of filling every possible beat, he allowed himself to wait, to let one phrase settle fully into silence before reaching for the next sound. It felt at first almost unbearable, as though he were failing simply by not playing. But as the silence stretched and then broke, he felt something shift in his own chest, a kind of release he had not expected. He did not yet know if he had learned the lesson fully, but he no longer believed, as he once had, that the unbroken beat was the better one. A few nights later, playing for a smaller gathering at the village's edge, the old fear of silence rose in him again as he sat down. It returns, and you choose again, each time, whether to fill the space or trust it, his teacher had told him. He let the silences stand anyway, hands trembling with the old urge, and the gathering grew unusually quiet, leaning in rather than away. In Lakota tradition, there is a similar understanding of rhythm and rest as inseparable parts of a single ceremony. Drumming is central to many Lakota ceremonies, and the drum is often spoken of as the heartbeat of the people, carrying both sound and silence as part of its sacred function. The drum beat is understood to connect the dancers' motion to the earth's stillness beneath their feet, motion and ground held together rather than apart. Lakota teaching also emphasizes the seasonal nature of ceremony itself, times for gathering, dancing and singing, and times for quiet, for waiting, for letting the land and the people rest before the next ceremony calls them together again. Neither phase is considered lesser than the other. This understanding extends to storytelling as well, where elders often leave deliberate silences between phrases, allowing listeners time to absorb what has been said before the next part of the story unfolds. The pause in this tradition is treated as part of the telling itself, not an absence of it. You may know the feeling of filling every space the way that young drummer once did, afraid that any silence in your day will be read as laziness. Perhaps you fill your evenings with tasks the moment one finishes, never letting a single hour simply pass without something to show for it. Perhaps you feel uneasy in conversation when it falls quiet, rushing to fill the gap rather than letting it breathe. Consider tonight that the silence in your life is not empty. It is doing work you cannot always see, the way the drummer's rest gathered weight before the next beat arrived. You might notice, too, that the fear of silence often returns even after you have learned once to trust it. That is not a sign you have failed to learn the lesson. It is simply how this particular practice works, returning again and again, asking to be chosen freshly each time rather than mastered once and forgotten. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it, the way the young drummer finally felt the chest-deep release of letting one phrase end before beginning the next. And as you rest here now, let this be your held silence, full of whatever tomorrow will need, asking nothing further of you tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A dance without pause is not more impressive. It is simply exhausting to watch because the eye, like the body, needs moments of stillness to register what motion even means. Yang in Taoist thought is the leap, the turn, the outward gesture. Yin is the held pose, the moment of complete stillness that gives the leap its shape and meaning. Without the pause, the leap is just movement, indistinguishable from any other. Consider how a single still photograph of a dancer mid-leap can move us more deeply than watching that same leap blur past in an unbroken sequence. Something in stillness lets us actually see what motion, alone, often rushes past unnoticed. We often praise the dancer who never seems to tire, who fills every beat of music with visible effort. But the body, watching such a dance, eventually grows numb to it, the way an eye grows numb to unbroken brightness with nowhere to rest. The greatest dancers understand that stillness is not the absence of dance. It is one of dance's most essential ingredients. Tonight's teaching turns toward that pause, the one moment of held breath that makes everything around it visible. There was a young dancer who trained with a renowned performer known for routines that left audiences breathless with their intensity. The young dancer believed the secret to this intensity was relentless motion, and so she rehearsed her own routines without a single still beat, leaping from one movement directly into the next, never holding a pose for even a moment, certain that any pause would break the spell she was trying to create. When she finally performed before an audience for the first time, she danced for the full length of the music without ever once stopping, proud of how continuous her performance had been. The applause afterward was polite but brief. The audience seemed unmoved in a way she could not understand, and she went to her teacher that evening, troubled. "I danced every single beat," she said. "I never once paused. Why did it not move them?" Her teacher considered this for a long moment before answering. "Tell me," she said, "what was the most important moment in your dance?" The young dancer thought and found she could not name one. Every movement had blurred into the next, with nothing standing apart from anything else. "There wasn't one," she admitted. "Why not?" "Because I never stopped moving long enough for anything to feel important," the young dancer said slowly, as though hearing the truth of it for the first time. Her teacher nodded. "When everything moves at the same intensity, nothing stands out. The eye cannot find a place to land. It is like trying to read a story with no punctuation, no paragraph breaks, no white space at all. Every word matters equally, which means nothing matters more than anything else." "But I thought pausing would look like weakness," the young dancer said, "like I had run out of strength or forgotten the next step." "Show me," her teacher said. "Dance for me now, and this time find one moment to hold completely still." The young dancer danced again, and at the midpoint of her routine, with great effort, she forced herself to stop, holding a single pose for 3 long breaths before continuing. It felt, in the moment, unbearably exposed, as though she were standing on stage with nothing to hide behind. When she finished, her teacher was quiet for a moment. "What did that pause feel like from inside your body?" her teacher asked. "Terrifying," the young dancer admitted. "I felt like everyone was staring straight through me." "They were," her teacher said, smiling slightly. "That is exactly what a pause is for. It is the moment the dance stops hiding behind motion and simply lets itself be seen." "I do not think I have ever let myself be seen like that before," the young dancer admitted. "Not just in dance, in anything." Her teacher nodded slowly, as though this did not surprise her. "Many of us learn early to keep moving so that no one looks too closely. Motion can be its own kind of hiding, if we use it that way. Tell me, when you watched other dancers you admired, what did you remember afterward?" The young dancer thought of the performances that had moved her most, and realized, turning them over in her memory, that what she remembered were not the fastest or most complex sequences, but the moments of held stillness. A raised arm frozen mid-air, a long suspended balance before a final turn. "Were you ever afraid of stillness when you were learning?" the young dancer asked her teacher. "Terribly," her teacher admitted. I avoided pauses for years, filling every measure of every routine, the same as you did tonight. It took watching another dancer's stillness move an entire audience to tears before I understood what I had been avoiding all along. How do you know which moments deserve the pause? The young dancer asked. You will feel a kind of weight building in the music, her teacher said, a sense that something is arriving before it actually does. That is usually the place to hold still, just before the weight resolves into the next movement. The stillness, she said, surprised. I remember the stillness more than the motion. That is because the stillness is where the audience finally has time to feel what the motion meant, her teacher said. Motion without pause is like a sentence with no end, running breathlessly into the next sentence and the next, until the listener simply stops listening, exhausted by the lack of any place to rest their attention. So the pause is not a break from the dance, the young dancer said. It is part of the dance. It is often the part the audience remembers longest, her teacher said. Yang without yin is just noise dressed up as energy. The pause is what lets the leap mean something. The young dancer asked to try her routine once more, and this time she built in several pauses, holding stillness at each moment that felt most important, letting her breath catch up with her before continuing. It felt strange at first, almost like failure, to stand motionless in front of anyone. But by the end, she understood, in her body rather than only her mind, why her teacher's performances left audiences so quietly undone. It was never only the motion. It was always also the stillness held inside it. She performed again some weeks later, this time at a larger gathering, and she found, standing in her first held pause before the crowd, that the old fear of looking weak returned in full force, just as her teacher had warned it might. It is hard every time, she admitted afterward. It will likely stay hard, her teacher said. Not because you have failed to learn it, but because exposing yourself even through stillness never stops asking something of you. The fear softens. It rarely disappears completely. Then how do you keep choosing the pause, performance after performance? I remember what the pause is actually for, her teacher said, not to make me look weak or strong, to let whoever is watching finally catch up to what they have already seen. That is worth the fear every time I face it again. The young dancer found that night that her pauses no longer felt like exposure alone. They felt increasingly like generosity, a gift of time offered to anyone watching, to simply feel what had already happened before the dance asked anything more of them. In Stoic philosophy, there is a similar understanding of restraint as something woven directly into right action rather than opposed to it. The Stoics taught that wisdom often shows itself not in constant activity, but in knowing when to hold back, when to let a moment pass without reacting, when stillness itself is the more disciplined choice. Marcus Aurelius wrote often of returning to a settled center rather than being pulled along by every passing impulse toward motion. Stoic practice also emphasized regular periods of quiet reflection, deliberately built into each day, not as indulgence, but as the discipline that made clear action possible afterward. The pause, in this view, was never wasted time. It was the preparation for everything that followed. Seneca wrote to friends often about the value of withdrawing briefly from constant activity, warning that a mind never given rest eventually loses its capacity for sound judgment altogether, much as the dancer's audience lost the capacity to feel anything distinct in motion that never paused. You may recognize something of that young dancer in the way you move through your own days, filling every hour so completely that nothing stands out as more important than anything else. Perhaps you rush from task to task without ever pausing long enough to notice what actually mattered in any of it. Perhaps you feel that stopping, even briefly, will look like you have run out of energy or commitment, the same fear the young dancer carried onto the stage. Consider tonight that your pauses are not gaps in your life. They are where your life becomes visible to you. The way the dancers held stillness became the moment her audience remembered longest. You might also notice that the fear of stillness rarely disappears for good, no matter how many times you have proven to yourself that it was worth choosing. That is simply how it works. Each pause asks something of you freshly, every time. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it, the way she finally felt the held breath of her own stillness landing, undefended, in front of an audience. And as you lie here now, let this be your held pose, the moment your whole day finally has somewhere to land. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A song without rests between its phrases is not more devoted, more skillful, or more impressive. It is simply harder to breathe through for the singer and for the listener alike. In Taoist understanding, Yang carries the rising phrase, the held note, the climbing melody. Yin carries the breath drawn in before the next phrase begins, the brief silence that lets meaning settle into the listener's ear. Neither can do the other's work. Even the most moving songs are not built from sound alone. They are built from sound shaped around silence, the way a sculpture is shaped as much by the absence of stone as by the stone that remains. We often imagine the most devoted singer as the one who never seems to need a breath, who carries each phrase forward into the next without any visible strain. But breath is not the enemy of a sustained melody. It is the only reason a melody can be sustained at all. A singer who refuses to rest between phrases eventually loses the very voice she is trying to preserve. Tonight's teaching turns toward breath itself, not as an interruption of song, but as song's quiet, necessary partner. There was a young singer who studied under a teacher renowned across the region for a voice that could hold a room silent for the length of an entire ballad. The young singer believed this power came from sheer endurance. from never letting a phrase end without immediately beginning the next, so that the song flowed as one unbroken line from beginning to end. She practiced this way for months, holding each breath as long as she could, forcing the next phrase out before her lungs had properly recovered. When she performed for the first time before her teacher's other students, her voice cracked twice, and by the final verse it had thinned to something barely audible. Afterward, her teacher asked her to sit with him, and for a while neither of them spoke. "I tried to make it sound like one continuous breath," the young singer finally said, "the way your songs sound, unbroken." Her teacher smiled faintly. "Have you ever truly listened to my breathing while I sing?" The young singer admitted she had not, focused as she always was on the notes themselves rather than the spaces around them. "Listen tonight," her teacher said, and he sang a short verse for her, slowly. This time she listened for the silences rather than the sound, and she noticed for the first time the small intake of breath before each new phrase, brief but unmistakably present. "You do rest," she said, almost accusingly, "between every phrase." "Of course," her teacher said. "How else would I have breath left for the next one?" "But it sounds unbroken," the young singer protested. "I have never noticed those rests before." "That is because they are placed where the phrase naturally ends," her teacher said. "A rest in the right place does not sound like an interruption. It sounds like punctuation. It tells the listener's ear that one thought has finished and another is about to begin." The young singer considered this. "I thought any pause would sound like weakness, like I had run out of voice." "There is a difference between running out of breath and choosing where to take it," her teacher said. "One is collapse, the other is craft." "How do I learn the difference?" the young singer asked. "It all feels the same from inside my own chest, whether I am choosing the breath or simply failing to hold the note any longer." "At first it will feel the same," her teacher admitted. "But over time you will learn to feel the moment a phrase has finished saying what it needs to say just before your breath actually runs out. That is the moment to rest. Waiting until collapse is no longer a choice at all. Tell me, what happened to your voice tonight when you refused to rest at all?" "It cracked," she admitted. "Twice. And by the end I could barely be heard, because you spent your breath as though it would never need replenishing," her teacher said. "The voice is not a well that fills itself while you are still drawing from it. It empties unless you let it rest and refill. You cannot sing convincingly on what is already gone." "How did you finally learn to trust the rest yourself?" the young singer asked. "I lost my voice entirely for almost a season after pushing it the way you did tonight," her teacher said. "It was a hard way to learn, and I would rather you learn it gently from listening than the way I learned it, through silence I did not choose." "So the rests are not a break from the song," the young singer said slowly. "They are what keeps the song possible at all." "Exactly," her teacher said. "Yang is the note you sustain, yin is the breath you draw before sustaining the next one. Without the second, the first eventually fails entirely, the way your voice failed tonight." The young singer asked her teacher to show her where exactly the rests belonged, whether there was a rule she could simply follow. "Not a rule," he said, "a listening. You will feel when a phrase has finished saying what it needed to say, That is where the rest belongs, however brief. Force a rest in the wrong place and it sounds like interruption. Let it arrive in the right place and it sounds like the song breathing on its own. She practiced again that evening, this time allowing herself a small breath at the end of each phrase rather than forcing herself through to the next without pause. It felt strange at first, as though she were admitting some kind of limitation, but by the third verse her voice had steadied, and she understood, finally, in a way she had not from simply being told, that the rest was not a gap in her devotion to the song. It was the thing that made her devotion sustainable at all. Weeks later, preparing for a performance before the whole village, the old fear returned to her, stronger than before. "What if they think I am weak for breathing so often?" she asked her teacher the night before. "Do you think I am weak when you hear me breathe between my phrases?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "I never even noticed it until you showed me." "That is because a breath placed well does not sound like weakness," he said. "It sounds like care. The fear you are carrying tonight is not really about breath. It is about being seen, needing anything at all. That fear visits every singer before every performance, no matter how long they have practiced." "Does it ever go away?" "Less and less," he said, "but it never disappears completely. You will likely feel some version of it again tomorrow, and the next time, and the time after that. The difference is, now you know what to do with it. You breathe anyway, and you sing." She did sing the next evening, and though her hands trembled faintly with the old fear as she drew her first deliberate breath before the crowd, her voice held, clear and whole, through every verse that followed. In Hindu philosophy, there is a similar understanding of rhythm as something that depends equally on sound and silence, expressed often through the concept of nada, the subtle vibration underlying all creation. Devotional chanting traditions across India often build deliberate silence into their structure, treating the pause between repetitions not as a gap, but as the space where the mantra's meaning settles into the body and mind. The silence is considered part of the practice, not a lapse in it. Hindu thought also speaks of prana, the breath that animates all life, understood as something that must be drawn in before it can be released. Action and rest, in this view, are stages of a single cycle, neither one able to substitute for the other. This same principle appears in classical Indian music, where deliberate pauses between phrases, called kali, mark essential turning points in a raga's structure, treated with as much intention as the notes themselves. You may know something of that young singer's strain, the feeling of pushing through exhaustion rather than resting, certain that stopping even briefly would somehow undo all the effort that came before it. Perhaps you have stayed up far later than your body wanted, finishing one more task rather than letting the day end where it naturally wanted to end. Perhaps you have spoken through an argument or a long day's worry without ever pausing to simply breathe and let the moment settle. Consider tonight that your own rests, however brief, are not interruptions to whatever you are building. They are the breath the next phrase of your life depends on. You may also notice that the old fear of looking weak by resting does not vanish simply because you have rested well once before. It tends to return, quieter each time, asking to be met again rather than solved permanently. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it. The way the young singer finally felt her own voice steady the moment she allowed herself to breathe. And as you lie here now, let this be your breath drawn in before the next phrase, however far off it may be. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A vine that is never allowed to rest will eventually stop producing fruit worth harvesting at all. The dormant season is not a failure of the vineyard. It is the season that makes the next harvest possible. In Taoist thought, Yang is the season of growth, the swelling fruit, the green and reaching vine. Yin is the bare season, when the vine appears to do nothing at all, drawing its strength quietly back into its roots. Both seasons belong to the same vine. A vineyard, seen across many years rather than just one, tells a story that no single season could tell alone. A long, slow trading of fullness and bareness, each preparing the ground for the other's return. We often measure a year by what it visibly produced, forgetting that the bare months are doing work just as essential as the harvest months, simply hidden from view. A keeper who tries to force fruit through every season eventually exhausts the very plant he depends on. Tonight's teaching turns toward dormancy, not as the vine's failure, but as its preparation. There was a vineyard keeper who inherited his land from his father and who believed more strongly than his father ever had that a vine left idle through winter was a vine wasting its potential. He had heard of methods to coax a small late harvest even in the cold months, forcing tender new growth through careful warming and feeding, and he applied these methods aggressively, determined that his vines would never again sit bare and seemingly lifeless through an entire season. For 2 years, his vines produced fruit almost continuously, and his neighbors marveled at his yield. But by the 3rd year, the fruit had grown smaller, less sweet, and the vines themselves looked thin and brittle, even in the height of summer, their leaves yellowing earlier than they should have. He went, troubled, to an old keeper who tended the oldest vineyard in the valley, vines that had outlived several generations of keepers before him. "My vines are failing," he said. "Though I have given them more care than anyone in the valley, I never let them sit idle. I force growth in every season." The old keeper walked with him through his vineyard, running a hand along the brittle stems. "How long since these vines have rested?" he asked. "Rested? I do not let them rest. Resting is wasted time. A vine that rests produces nothing." The old keeper was quiet for a while before answering. "Tell me what happens beneath the soil in winter, in a vineyard that is allowed to sleep." The young keeper admitted he did not entirely know, having never let his vines experience an undisturbed winter long enough to observe it. "The roots deepen," the old keeper said. "The vine draws its sugars back down into itself, storing strength it cannot store while it is busy producing fruit above ground. The dormant season is not the vine doing nothing. It is the vine doing the one thing it cannot do while it is growing, gathering itself for what comes next. But my vines produced fruit for 2 straight years, the young keeper said, more than anyone's. And now your fruit is smaller, and your vines are brittle, the old keeper said. You have been spending what should have been saved. A vine forced to produce without rest is like a purse spent down to nothing, with no chance to ever be refilled. The young keeper looked at his thinning vines with new unease. I thought I was helping them. I thought rest was simply lost time. It is the opposite, the old keeper said. The bare season looks like nothing is happening, but it is when the roots do their deepest work unseen. You cannot watch dormancy and call it idle. You are only watching the part you cannot see. Did you always trust the bare season this completely? The young keeper asked, curious despite his unease. No, the old keeper admitted. My own father forced his vines for years, the way you have, and I learned the habit from him before I learned anything better. It took losing an entire row of old vines, the ones my grandfather had planted, before I finally believed the rest mattered as much as the reaching. What made you finally believe it, rather than simply hoping it was true? The young keeper asked. The first harvest after I let the vines rest properly, the old keeper said, I had expected less fruit, smaller fruit, the same disappointment I feared for you. Instead, the grapes were sweeter than any I had grown before, and there were more of them. After that, I never doubted the bare season again. How long shall I let them rest? The young keeper asked. As long as the season asks, the old keeper said. Not a single day more forced into growth than the vine wants to give. The vines that have outlived 3 generations in this valley are the ones whose keepers learned early to stop measuring a vineyard's worth by how much fruit it gave every single year and started measuring it by how long it would keep giving fruit at all. The young keeper asked whether it would cost him a season's harvest to let his vines finally rest properly. It may cost you this year's harvest, the old keeper admitted, but it may also be the only way to have a harvest worth having in 10 years or 20. You have been thinking in seasons. The old vines think in lifetimes. That winter, for the first time since he had inherited the land, the young keeper let his vines stand bare and untouched, resisting every instinct to coax growth from them before their time. It unsettled him, watching them appear so lifeless under the frost. But he found himself more than once walking the rows simply to notice the quiet, and wondering if the stillness he saw above ground might, after all, be hiding the most important work of the entire year. In early spring, the old keeper returned to see how the vines had fared. The young keeper led him through the rows, anxious, half expecting to be told he had simply lost a year for nothing. They looked the same as they did months ago, the young keeper said, almost apologizing. I do not know if the rest did anything at all. The old keeper crouched and examined the base of one vine closely, then another. Look here, he said, pointing to new growth just beginning to push through, firmer and thicker than anything the young keeper remembered from his forced seasons. That looks different, the young keeper admitted, surprised. It is the growth of a vine that has finally been allowed to gather itself, the old keeper said. You will not know the full difference until autumn, when the fruit comes in, but I would wager it will be sweeter, and there will be more of it, than anything your forcing ever produced. The young keeper found himself in the weeks that followed checking the vines daily, watching for signs that the dormant season had truly done its work, no longer dismissing the quiet months as simply lost time. In Buddhist teaching, there is a similar understanding of cycles that include both growth and apparent stillness as equally necessary. Buddhist thought speaks often of impermanence, the truth that all things arise, flourish, decline, and rest before arising again in some new form. Trying to hold any phase in place, including the phase of constant productivity, is considered a form of suffering, a resistance to how things actually move. Buddhist monastic practice also includes designated periods of retreat, when monks and nuns withdraw from ordinary activity entirely to sit in stillness rather than service. This withdrawal is not considered a lapse in devotion. It is treated as essential to sustaining devotion at all, the same way the old keepers' bare vines were sustaining their next harvest. Buddhist teaching also describes the changing seasons of practice itself, noting that periods of apparent stagnation in one's own growth often precede the deepest shifts in understanding, much as the vineyard's bare winter precedes its richest harvest. You may recognize something of that young keeper's fear in your own relationship to rest, the sense that any unproductive season is wasted, that a project left fallow or a relationship given space is somehow failing rather than gathering strength. Perhaps you have never let a creative project simply sit untouched, certain that momentum, once lost, can never be recovered. Perhaps you have pushed a friendship or a partnership to constantly perform closeness without ever allowing it the quiet, undemanding seasons that let real connection deepen underground. Consider tonight that whatever in your life looks dormant right now may simply be doing its deepest work where you cannot see it. You may feel, even now, the old urge to check whether the rest is working, to demand some visible proof before you allow yourself to trust it. That urge is common, and it softens with time, but it rarely vanishes outright. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it, the way the old keeper felt the quiet of his vineyard differently once he stopped mistaking stillness for absence. And as you lie here now, let yourself be the vine in winter, gathering strength you do not need to account for tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A watchman who never sleeps does not become more vigilant. He becomes less able to notice anything at all, his attention worn thin by hours that never end. In Taoist thought, Yang is the alert watch, the eyes open against the dark. Yin is the deep sleep that restores the very capacity for alertness. A watch kept without rest is not a stronger watch. It is a watch slowly losing the sharpness it was meant to provide. We often imagine the most devoted guardian as the one who never closes his eyes, who treats sleep itself as a kind of betrayal of duty. But an eye kept open too long stops truly seeing, the way a muscle held tense too long stops truly holding. Vigilance and rest are not rivals competing for the same hours. They take turns, each preparing the ground for the other. Tonight's teaching turns toward the watchman who could not see this until something nearly slipped past him in the dark. There was a watchman assigned to guard the gate of a small mountain settlement, and he took his duty with a seriousness that bordered on fear. He had heard stories of raiders who struck only when a watch grew careless, and he resolved from his very first night that he would never be the cause of such a failure. He kept himself awake through every night of his post, refusing to hand his watch to anyone else, even briefly, certain that sleep itself was the one weakness an enemy might exploit. For many nights nothing happened, and he took this as proof that his unbroken vigilance was working. He grew proud of how long he could go without rest, boasting quietly to himself that no one else in the settlement could match his endurance. But one night, deep into a watch that had by then stretched across many sleepless days, he found himself staring at the gate without truly seeing it. His eyes were open, his body upright, but his mind had gone somewhere distant and foggy, and when a small group of travellers approached the gate, he did not notice them until they were nearly upon him. They turned out to be harmless, merchants seeking shelter for the night, but the fright of it stayed with him long after they had passed safely through. He realized, shaken, that he had been standing watch in body only. His mind had simply stopped being there. He went the next morning to the settlement's elder, troubled by what had nearly happened. "I did not sleep," he said. "I have not slept properly in longer than I can count, and still I nearly failed at the one thing I am here to do." The elder considered him for a long moment. "How many nights since you last slept fully?" The watchman admitted he could not remember. "And in all that time," the elder asked, "has your watch grown sharper or duller?" The watchman wanted to say sharper, out of pride, but he thought of the fog that had swallowed his attention the night before and could not bring himself to lie. "Duller," he admitted, "much duller." "Why do you think that is?" "I assumed staying awake longer meant watching more carefully," the watchman said slowly. "But it seems the opposite has happened. The longer I go without rest, the less I actually see, even with my eyes open." "What finally made you understand this?" the watchman asked the elder, eager now for any insight that might prevent another near failure of his own. "A night much like the one you just described," the elder said. "I stood my post for nearly a week without proper sleep, certain my devotion alone would carry me through. It nearly did not. I have never forgotten how close that came to costing more than it should have." The elder nodded. "A watchman's gift is not his eyes, it is his attention. And attention, like any other strength, depletes with use and restores with rest. You have been spending it without ever replenishing it, the way a purse is spent down to nothing if no coin is ever added back." "Did you ever doubt this when you were younger?" the watchman asked the elder. "I doubted it for years," the elder admitted. "I kept watch the same way you have, certain that any sleep was a kind of cowardice. It was only after I nearly missed something far more dangerous than merchants that I finally understood what my own exhaustion was costing the settlement, not just myself." "What finally convinced you to share the post with others?" the watchman asked. "Watching a rested watchman catch what I, exhausted, had missed for an entire week," the elder said. "It was humbling, but it taught me more in one night than years of stubborn pride ever had. But if I sleep, who watches the gate? The watchman asked. Another watchman, the elder said. That is why there is more than one of you. You have been treating your post as though you alone must hold back the entire night, every night without relief. No single watchman was ever meant to do that. I thought asking for relief would look like weakness, the watchman admitted, like I could not be trusted with the post. It is the opposite, the elder said. A watchman who never rests is the one who cannot be trusted, because his watch grows hollow even while his body stands at the gate. A watchman who rests properly and returns sharp and alert is the one actually capable of protecting anyone. The watchman thought of the fog that had nearly cost the settlement its safety, and felt a chill at how close it had come, not because the threat had been real, but because his own readiness had not been. How do I know when to rest and when to stay alert? He asked. You will learn the rhythm of it, the elder said, the way the night itself has a rhythm, the deepest dark, then the gradual lightening before dawn. Yang and yin trading places without conflict, neither one trying to hold the sky forever. Your watch was never meant to be unbroken. It was meant to be sustainable. That night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the watchman allowed another to take his post for several hours while he slept fully, without guilt, without the fear that resting made him less devoted to his duty. When he returned to the gate before dawn, he noticed, almost immediately, how much sharper the dark felt against his rested eyes, how much more, simply, he could see. Some weeks later, a real threat did come. A small band of raiders testing the settlement's defenses in the deep hours before dawn. The watchman, having slept fully the evening before, heard them long before they reached the gate, the faint scrape of boots on stone carrying clearly to his rested ears. He raised the alarm in time, and the settlement gathered itself before any harm was done. Afterward, the elder asked him what had made the difference. I heard them, the watchman said, still somewhat amazed at himself. Months ago I would not have. I was too tired to hear anything past my own exhaustion. And tonight? Tonight I had something left to give, he said. I understand now what you meant. The rest was not time stolen from my watch. It was where my watch's sharpness came from in the first place. Will the fear of resting return? The elder asked, almost gently testing him. Probably, the watchman admitted. Some nights I still feel as though closing my eyes is a kind of failure, but I trust it less than I used to. That is enough, the elder said. You do not need to stop feeling the fear. You only need to stop believing it. In Hasidic Jewish teaching, there is a similar understanding of rest as sacred obligation rather than mere convenience, most visible in the practice of Shabbat. Shabbat asks for a complete cessation of labor for an entire day each week, not because rest is permitted, but because rest is commanded, treated as equally essential to a well-lived life as the work that surrounds it. The Hasidic masters taught that without this rest, even sacred work loses its proper shape. Hasidic teaching also speaks of the soul needing its own kind of sleep, a withdrawal from constant striving that allows a person to return to their efforts renewed rather than depleted. Rest, in this telling, is not the watchman's weakness. It is the discipline that makes true vigilance possible. Some Hasidic masters taught that even prayer itself benefits from rest between sessions, warning that ceaseless devotion without pause can become hollow, performed by rote rather than felt with the whole heart it was meant to carry. You may recognize something of that watchman's fear in your own resistance to rest, the sense that stopping, even briefly, means something important might slip past you. Perhaps you check messages late into the night rather than letting your attention truly rest, certain that vigilance must be unbroken to count as care. Perhaps you push through exhaustion at work, refusing a single day away, convinced that anyone who steps back even briefly cannot be trusted with what matters. Consider tonight that your own rest does not weaken your watch over your life. It is what makes your watch sharp enough to matter at all. You may notice the old fear surfacing even now, the sense that letting go of vigilance, even for one night, risks something important. That fear is common, and it softens each time you rest anyway and find, the next morning, that nothing was lost. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it, the way the watchman finally felt the difference rested eyes made against the dark. And as you lie here now, let another watch keep the night for you, while you finally, fully rest. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A runner who refuses to ever slow down does not finish faster. He simply finishes broken, or does not finish at all. In Taoist understanding, yang is the surging stride, the hard climb, the burst of speed when the path allows it. Yin is the eased pace, the warped stretch, the moment the body is permitted to recover before the next demand arrives. Distance is never covered by speed alone. It is covered by the wisdom of knowing when to ease. We often admire the runner who refuses to ease even once, mistaking that refusal for strength rather than recognizing it for what it usually is, a body spending itself faster than it can be replenished. The runners who finish longest distances are rarely the ones who never slow. They are the ones who understood early that pace is a conversation between effort and rest, not a contest to suppress one entirely. Tonight's teaching turns toward that conversation. There was a young runner who trained to compete in a long mountain race that wound across many days of difficult terrain, and who believed that any slowing of pace, even briefly, was a sign of weakness he could not afford. He trained by sprinting every stretch of his practice route, refusing to ever drop to a walk, certain that a runner who never eased his pace would simply arrive sooner than one who did. His early times over short distances were the fastest in his village, and this only deepened his conviction. But on the day of the long race itself, his body began to fail him far sooner than he expected. By midday of the first stage, his legs had grown heavy and unresponsive, and by evening he had fallen far behind runners he had easily outpaced in training. An older runner, competing in his final season, caught up to him on a quiet stretch of trail and slowed to walk beside him. "You started faster than anyone," the older runner said. "What happened?" I do not know, the young runner admitted, frustrated nearly to tears. I trained harder than anyone. I never let myself slow down once. Never? The older runner asked. Not even on the steep climbs or after a long stretch in the heat? Never, the young runner said. I believed slowing down meant losing ground I could never regain. The older runner walked in silence for a while before responding. Tell me, on your hardest training days, did you recover quickly afterward, or did it take you longer and longer to feel right again? The young runner thought about this. Longer, he admitted. Each week it took longer to feel ready for the next run. I thought that meant I was simply working hard enough. It meant you were spending more than you were replacing, the older runner said. A body sprinting constantly never has the chance to recover its strength before being asked for more. You arrived at this race already running on what was left of an empty reserve. But you are still walking steadily, the young runner said, glancing at the older man's measured pace. And you are ahead of me now, despite walking. I am ahead of you, the older runner agreed, because I have been running this race for many years, and I learned long ago that the walk is not a failure of the run, it is part of the run. My legs recover on the walked stretches. That recovery is what lets me run again hours later, with something left to give. Did you always run this way? The young runner asked. No, the older runner admitted. In my first long race, I ran exactly as you did, refusing to ease, certain that any walk would cost me the whole distance. I collapsed before the second stage and had to be carried the rest of the way. It took that failure before I learned to trust the walk at all. Was it hard to accept after pushing so hard to be the fastest? Harder than the running itself, the older runner admitted. I had built my whole sense of myself around never slowing down. Learning to walk in front of others felt at first like admitting defeat. It took several races before it began to feel like wisdom instead. How do you know when to walk and when to run? The young runner asked. I listen to what my body is actually telling me rather than what my pride wants to hear, the older runner said. Yang wants to sprint every stretch and call it discipline. Yin knows that discipline sometimes means easing the pace so that the sprint, when it matters most, is still possible. The young runner walked beside him for a while, feeling, despite himself, a measure of relief in the easier pace, a softening in his legs that he had not allowed himself in longer than he could remember. I am afraid that if I slow down now, I will never finish, he admitted. You are more likely to finish by slowing down than by refusing to, the older runner said. The race rewards whoever crosses the final line, not whoever sprinted hardest at the start. Pace yourself like the day has more than one part to it, because it does. They walked together for some time, and then, when the trail eased downhill, the older runner broke gently back into a steady run, inviting the young runner to match him rather than outpace him. For the first time that day, the young runner felt something other than desperation in his legs. A rhythm instead of effort and ease trading places, neither one trying to dominate the other. He did not finish that day's stage among the fastest, but he finished it upright and able the next morning to begin again. On the third day of the race, the young runner found himself once more tempted to sprint every stretch, the old fear of falling behind creeping back the moment his legs felt strong again. He sought out the older runner that evening, troubled by how quickly the old habit had returned. I thought I had learned this already, he said, but today I caught myself sprinting the climbs again, refusing to ease, just like before. That does not surprise me, the older runner said. The fear of slowing down does not leave just because you understood it once. It returns whenever your legs feel capable again, whispering that this time surely you can manage without easing. How do you stop listening to it? You do not stop entirely, the older runner admitted. You simply notice it sooner each time and choose the walk anyway, even while the fear is still talking. That noticing gets a little easier with practice, though it never disappears completely. The young runner walked beside him in silence for a while, turning this over. So this is something I will have to keep choosing every single day of the race. Every single day, the older runner agreed, and likely every race after this one, too. That is not a flaw in what you are learning. That is simply what pacing yourself actually means. By the race's final stage, the young runner had grown accustomed to the rhythm of easing and pushing in turn, and he crossed the final line 2 full days after the leaders, but upright, steady, and already imagining the next long distance he might attempt. In Japanese Zen tradition, there is a similar understanding of pacing as a discipline in itself, often expressed through the practice of walking meditation, known as kinhin. Kinhin alternates with seated meditation, allowing practitioners to move the body deliberately and slowly between long stretches of stillness. Neither the sitting nor the walking is considered more important. They are understood as two halves of the same practice, each restoring the capacity for the other. Zen teaching also speaks of effort without strain, a quality sometimes called relaxed concentration, in which the practitioner gives full attention without forcing the body or mind beyond what they can sustainably offer. The old runner's eased pace reflects exactly this: full presence without unnecessary strain. Zen masters have also taught that the same mind that strains too hard toward enlightenment often blocks its own arrival, much as the young runner's relentless sprinting blocked the very distance he was trying to cover. You may recognize something of that young runner's desperate sprinting in how you move through your own demanding seasons, refusing to ease your pace even when your body is asking clearly for it. Perhaps you push through exhaustion at the end of a long day rather than allowing yourself an early night, certain that finishing strong requires never slowing down. Perhaps you measure your worth by how relentless your pace appears to others, even as your own body quietly grows heavier with each passing week. Consider tonight that easing your pace is not the failure of your effort. It is the thing that makes your effort sustainable across the whole distance of your life. You may find the old urge to sprint everything returning even after a season of pacing yourself well. That is not failure. It is simply the pattern asking once again to be noticed and set down. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it, the way the young runner finally felt his legs soften into rhythm beside the older man's steady stride. And as you lie here now, let this be your eased pace, your walked stretch, your permission to recover before tomorrow asks anything more of you. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Dough that is never given time to rest never rises properly, no matter how skillfully it is kneaded or how hot the oven burns. Something in bread can only happen in stillness. In Taoist thought, yang is the kneading, the active shaping, the visible work of hands-on dough. Yang is the long, quiet rise, when nothing appears to be happening at all, though everything that matters most is happening invisibly within. Bread depends on both in equal measure. We tend to trust only what we can watch happening. But some of the most important transformations occur precisely when we stop watching, when we let the unseen process finish on its own time. A baker who distrusts the rise, who keeps reaching back into the dough out of impatience, ruins what could have become something whole. Tonight's teaching turns toward that quiet rise, the part of the work that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. There was a baker who took over his family's small bakery from his aging mother, eager to prove that he could produce more loaves faster than she ever had. His mother had always let her dough rest for long stretches, sometimes most of a day, before shaping it for the oven, and the young baker found this maddening. He believed the resting time was simply wasted hours in which nothing useful happened, and he began shaping his dough and baking it almost as soon as it was mixed, certain that speed would let him serve twice as many customers. His early loaves came out of the oven looking presentable enough, and for a few days customers bought them without complaint. But within the week, people began to notice that his bread was dense, heavy, difficult to chew, lacking the airy lightness his mother's loaves had always had. His mother, watching from the back of the shop, said nothing for several days, until finally the young baker came to her, frustrated. "I'm working harder than you ever did," he said. "I'm in this kitchen from before dawn until well past dark, and still my bread is worse than yours." His mother wiped flour from her hands and considered him for a long moment. "Did you watch your own mother make this same mistake when she was young?" the baker asked. "She told me once that her own teacher made her start over an entire batch simply to prove the point," his mother said. "Some lessons seem to need repeating in every generation until someone finally lets them stick." "How long do you let your dough rest before shaping it?" "As little as possible," he admitted. "I cannot waste hours waiting for nothing to happen." "Nothing?" his mother asked. "Tell me, what do you think is happening inside the dough while it sits?" The young baker had never really considered it. "Nothing," he said again, less certainly this time. "It just sits there. Come," his mother said, and she brought out 2 bowls of dough, mixed at the same time that morning. One she set aside to rest, the other she handed to him, instructing him to shape it immediately, as he always did. Hours later, she had him compare the 2 side by side before baking. The rested dough had grown noticeably, its surface smooth and slightly domed. The unrested dough sat flat and tight, barely changed from when he had first shaped it. "What happened in this one?" she said, pointing to the rested dough, "while it sat untouched?" The young baker frowned at it. "I don't know. I never let mine sit long enough to see it happen." "The yeast has been working this entire time," his mother said, "feeding, multiplying, releasing the gas that makes bread light. You cannot see it happening the way you can see your hands kneading, but it is happening nonetheless. It is simply work that requires stillness instead of motion." "But surely my kneading matters more," the young baker said. "I am the one shaping the bread. The dough just sits there. Your kneading and the dough's resting are not in competition," his mother said. "They are two stages of the same process. The kneading develops the structure that will hold the rise. The rise is what gives the structure something worth holding. Skip the rise and your kneading produces nothing but dense, tight bread, exactly like what you have been serving all week." The young baker looked again at the two bowls, ashamed at how confidently he had dismissed what he could not see happening. "I thought I was being more efficient," he said. "You were being faster," his mother said. "Not more efficient. A loaf that fails to rise properly is not bread made quickly. It is bread made incompletely. The hours you saved, you spent instead on bread no one wanted to eat for very long." "Did you ever rush the rise yourself when you were learning?" the young baker asked his mother. "Often," she admitted. "Your grandmother taught me this same lesson, the same way I am teaching you now, and I resisted it for a long while, certain that my own impatience was simply efficiency. It took many disappointing loaves before I trusted the rise the way she always had." "How do I know how long to let it rest?" he asked. "You will learn to read the dough," she said. "It will tell you in its own way when it has risen enough, by its size, by how it springs back gently under your finger. You cannot rush this by wanting it to be finished sooner. The yeast works at its own pace, regardless of how impatient you are." That evening, for the first time since taking over the bakery, the young baker mixed his dough and then walked away from it entirely, resisting every urge to return and shape it before its time. He found the waiting nearly unbearable, accustomed as he had become to constant motion in the kitchen. But when he finally returned, hours later, and felt the dough's soft risen give beneath his hand, he understood, for the first time, that the stillness had not been empty at all. A few days later, with a large order due for a village celebration, the young baker felt the old panic rising again, certain there was not enough time to let each batch rest properly before baking. He went to his mother, half hoping she would tell him it was acceptable to rush just this once. "There is too much to bake and not enough hours," he said. "Surely this time I can shorten the rise." His mother considered him kindly. "Do you remember the bread you served last week? The one that finally rose properly?" "Yes," he admitted. "Everyone said it was the best bread we had served in months." "And do you think the dough cared how busy your week was, or how large the order?" He had no answer. The dough, he realized, would rise at its own pace, regardless of his deadlines, the same as it always had. "Then plan around the rise," his mother said. "Rather than asking the rise to plan around you, begin earlier. Mix more batches in sequence, so each has its proper time. The bread does not need to bend to your schedule needs to bend to the bread." He restructured his entire week around the dough's own unhurried pace. And though it meant rising hours before dawn to begin the first batches, every loaf that left his oven that week held the same likeness his mother's had always carried. In Celtic wisdom, there is a similar understanding of thresholds and quiet gestation as sacred rather than empty, often expressed in the reverence for liminal times, dusk, dawn, the turning points of the year. Celtic tradition honored times like Samhain, when the visible world was believed to grow thin and quiet, and the unseen world was understood to be doing its own essential work, unseen but no less real than the bright festivals of summer. Stillness, in this view, was never considered absence. Celtic storytelling also often features the other world, a realm entered through quiet, hidden places, where transformation happens away from ordinary sight. The baker's resting dough, working unseen beneath its still surface, echoes this same trust that the unseen hours carry their own necessary work. Celtic seasonal festivals, marking the turning points of the agricultural year, similarly honored the quiet months between harvests as sacred rather than empty, understanding the land's stillness as preparation rather than neglect. You may recognize something of that impatient baker in your own relationship to unfinished things, distrusting any process that does not show visible progress at every step. Perhaps you rush a difficult conversation toward resolution before either person has had time to truly sit with what was said. Perhaps you abandon a creative project the moment it stalls, mistaking the quiet middle of the work for failure rather than the necessary rise before it can be shaped again. Consider tonight that whatever feels unfinished or stalled in your life right now may simply be resting the way dough rests, doing work you cannot see from the outside. You may feel the urge to rush it anyway, especially when deadlines or expectations press in. That urge is common, and it eases each time you choose, instead, to plan around the resting rather than against it. You do not need to understand this fully tonight, only feel it, the way the young baker finally felt the soft give of dough that had been allowed its proper time. And as you lie here now, let yourself be the dough at rest, rising quietly toward whatever shape tomorrow will ask of you. Let us pause here for a moment, take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Freshly cut wood carved too soon warps and cracks no matter how skilled the hands that shape it. Wood needs time, simply sitting still before it can become anything lasting. In Taoist thought, yang is the carving, the cutting, the active shaping of raw material into form. Yin is the long season of waiting, when the wood does nothing visible at all, slowly releasing what it does not need to keep. Mastery depends on both, in their proper order. We often believe that talent alone determines the quality of finished work, forgetting that even the most skillful hands cannot rush certain processes without the material itself paying the price later. A maker who cannot bear to wait often produces work that fails exactly where patience was required. Tonight's teaching turns toward that long, quiet waiting, the part of craftsmanship that asks nothing of the hands at all. There was a young instrument maker who had just opened his own workshop, eager to build a reputation faster than his teacher ever had. His teacher had always let cut wood season for at least 2 full years before carving it into the body of a stringed instrument, allowing the moisture within the wood to slowly and evenly release. The young maker found this unbearably slow. He began carving wood within weeks of cutting it, convinced that his obvious talent could overcome whatever the wood still lacked in readiness. His early instruments looked beautiful, finely carved, polished to a fine shine, and customers were eager to buy them. But within a season, several were returned to him. Their wood warped, their joints split, the once clear tone gone dull and uneven. He carried one of the failed instruments to his old teacher, frustrated and a little ashamed. "I carved it perfectly," he said. "I followed every technique you ever taught me, and still it failed." His teacher turned the instrument over in his hands, running a finger along a crack near its base. "How long did this wood season before you carved it?" "A few weeks," the young maker admitted. "I did not see the use in waiting longer. The wood looked ready." "Looked ready," his teacher repeated. "Tell me what is happening inside wood while it seasons that you cannot see by looking at it." The young maker had no real answer. "It just sits there," he said. "Drying, I suppose?" "It is releasing moisture slowly, evenly from deep within itself," his teacher said. "If you carve it before that release has finished, the wood keeps trying to release that moisture after it is already shaped, and the shape cannot hold. It cracks or warps, exactly as this one has." "But 2 years feels like such a waste," the young maker said. "I could build a dozen instruments in that time if I did not wait." "You could build a dozen instruments that fail within a season," his teacher said, not unkindly. "Or you could build half as many that last a lifetime. Which dozen do you think builds a reputation?" The young maker considered the cracked instrument in his teacher's hands, the instrument he had been so proud of only months before. "I thought waiting meant I was not working," he said. "I felt like I was doing nothing useful with that wood, just letting it sit in the corner of my workshop." "It was doing the most useful thing it could do," his teacher said. "It was becoming wood that could finally hold a shape without fighting against it. You were not doing nothing by waiting. You were allowing something necessary to finish before asking your hands to begin." "Did you ever lose a fine piece of wood to your own impatience?" the young maker asked. "More than one," his teacher admitted with a small, rueful laugh. "Some of my finest early failures are still in a drawer in the back of my workshop, cracked and warped, kept there to remind me what impatience costs. I look at them sometimes still when I feel the old urge to rush a new piece." "Why keep them instead of simply discarding the reminder?" "Because the urge to rush never fully leaves," his teacher said. "Seeing the cracked wood is more honest than trusting my own memory alone. Memory forgets. The wood does not." "How do you know when wood has seasoned enough?" the young maker asked. "You learn its weight," his teacher said. "Seasoned wood feels lighter in the hand than it looks, because the moisture that once filled it has gone. You learn to listen to it, too, tap it, and a seasoned piece rings differently than a green one. These are things you cannot rush yourself into knowing. They come only with the waiting, both the wood's and your own." The young maker asked whether there was any way to season wood faster, some technique his teacher might know that would shorten the long, quiet years. "There are ways to speed it modestly," his teacher said. "Kilns and careful drying rooms. But there is no way to skip the waiting entirely without the wood paying the price for it later, the way your instrument paid for it now. Some things move at their own pace, regardless of how much you want them to move at yours." The young maker returned to his workshop and set aside a fresh stock of cut wood, marking the date on each piece, resolving to leave it untouched for as long as it needed. It unsettled him deeply to watch his workshop fill with wood he could not yet use, certain as he had always been that visible busyness was the only proof of real work. But he found himself returning every so often simply to lift a piece and feel, for himself, whether its weight had begun to change. A customer came to his workshop some months later, eager for a new instrument, offering to pay handsomely for quick delivery. The old urge to rush returned immediately, sharper than he expected. "I have wood that has only seasoned a few months," he admitted to his teacher that evening. "The customer is offering more than I have ever been paid. Surely a few months is close enough." His teacher studied him for a long moment. "Do you remember the cracked instrument you brought me, the one that taught you this lesson in the first place?" "I remember it well," the young maker said, somewhat ashamed. "Then you already know what a few months of seasoning will produce," his teacher said. "The offer is generous. It does not change what the wood needs." "It is hard to turn away," the young maker admitted. "I keep telling myself this time will be different." "It will not be," his teacher said, not unkindly. "Wood does not negotiate. You may turn down this commission, or take it with wood that has properly seasoned, even if that means a longer wait than the customer wants. Either choice is honest. Rushing the wood is not." The young maker turned down the hurried commission, offering instead to deliver a properly seasoned instrument the following year, and though he feared losing the customer entirely, the man agreed to wait, intrigued, he said, by a craftsman willing to say no to easy money. In Ubuntu philosophy, found across many Southern African traditions, there is a similar understanding that what matters most often develops slowly, through unseen relationship rather than forced individual effort. Ubuntu teaches that a person becomes a person through other people, a process that cannot be rushed or accomplished alone, much the way wood cannot be hurried into readiness by the carver's impatience alone. Community, like seasoned wood, is built through long, often invisible accumulation. Ubuntu tradition also emphasizes patience in conflict and reconciliation, understanding that true repair between people takes the time it takes and cannot be forced into a faster shape without leaving cracks that surface later. The instrument maker's seasoning wood and Ubuntu's patient repair share this same trust in unhurried time. Ubuntu philosophy also speaks of generational knowledge, passed slowly from elder to younger over years, rather than imparted all at once, trusting that wisdom, like wood, needs its own season to settle properly into a person. You may recognize something of that impatient maker in how you treat your own unfinished growth, expecting yourself to be fully formed before you have given yourself the time that real change actually requires. Perhaps you have rushed into a new role or relationship before you had properly processed what came before it, carrying old cracks into new shapes. Perhaps you judge yourself harshly for needing more time to heal or learn than you think you should, as though your own seasoning were a personal failure rather than simply how growth works. Consider tonight that whatever in you still feels unready may simply need more time sitting quietly, the way wood needs its season before it can be carved without cracking. You may feel pressure, even now, to rush your own healing or growth simply because an opportunity or expectation has arrived sooner than you feel ready for. That pressure is real, but it does not change what you actually need. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it, the way the young maker finally felt the changed weight of wood given its proper time. And as you lie here now, let yourself be the wood still seasoning, asked for nothing yet, simply allowed to become ready in your own unhurried time. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A swimmer who refuses to ever float, who insists on constant strong strokes through every stretch of open water, exhausts herself long before reaching any distant shore. In Taoist thought, yang is the strong stroke, the active push against the water. Yin is the float, the moment the body simply rests on the water's surface, letting it carry weight rather than fighting it. Long water is crossed by trusting both in turn. A swimmer who has never floated does not know her own buoyancy. She has only ever fought the water, never once discovered that it was willing the whole time to hold her without being asked twice. We often equate constant effort with seriousness, as though anyone who pauses must not truly want to reach the far shore. But the body that never rests in open water eventually has nothing left to give the water at all. The float is not laziness disguised as swimming. It is how a swimmer survives a distance too great for strokes alone. Tonight's teaching turns toward that trust, the trust that water too can hold you. There was a young swimmer training to cross a wide channel of open water between two distant points of coastline, a crossing few in her village had ever completed. She trained by swimming hard, constant strokes, refusing to ever stop and float, certain that any pause in her motion would let the current pull her backward, undoing whatever distance she had gained. In her practice, swims along the shore, this approach seemed to work well enough, and she grew confident in her endurance. On the day of her actual crossing, she set out strong, her strokes steady and sure. But by the midpoint of the channel, far from either shore, her arms had grown heavy in a way her shorter practice swims had never prepared her for, and she began to panic, certain that any slowing meant she would be swept away and lost. An older swimmer, escorting her in a small boat alongside the crossing, called out to her as her strokes grew ragged. "Stop swimming," the older woman called. "Just float." "I cannot stop," the young swimmer gasped between strokes. "The current will take me." "Float," the older woman called again. "Trust the water to hold you for a moment." Reluctantly, against every instinct she had trained into herself, the young swimmer let her body go still, rolling onto her back, and found, to her surprise, that the water did indeed hold her, gently, without effort on her part at all. "I'm floating," she called out, almost disbelieving. "You are?" the older woman said from the boat. "Now breathe. Let your arms rest. The current has not taken you anywhere in the last minute, has it?" The young swimmer checked the distant shore, still roughly where it had been a few moments before. "No," she admitted. "I'm still nearly where I was." "The float does not cost you the distance you fear losing," the older woman said. It only feels that way because you have trained yourself to believe that stopping means failing. But the water was never your enemy. It has been holding you this entire time. You simply never let it because you never stopped long enough to find out. Have you ever panicked out here the way I did today? The young swimmer asked, still catching her breath. More times than I can count, the older woman said. Every long crossing I have ever made included at least one moment of pure fear, certain that stopping would mean drowning rather than resting. The fear never fully stopped visiting. I simply learned, eventually, not to let it choose for me. The young swimmer floated for a while longer, feeling her arms slowly recover their strength, the tightness in her shoulders easing. "Why did no one teach me this before?" she asked. "Many do learn it," the older woman said, "but only after nearly drowning from refusing to. Strength is not only in the stroke, it is also in knowing when the stroke needs to stop, so it can begin again with something left to give." "I was so afraid that floating meant giving up," the young swimmer said. "It is the opposite," the older woman said. "Refusing to float is what actually causes swimmers to give up, exhausted, far from shore. The float is not surrender. It is the rest that makes the rest of the crossing possible." When her arms had recovered enough, the young swimmer returned to her strokes, and this time, every so often, she allowed herself to roll back and float for a short while before continuing, trusting the water rather than fighting it the entire distance. She finished the crossing far later than she had originally hoped, but she finished it, arriving at the far shore on her own strength rather than being pulled exhausted into the escort boat partway across, as so many before her had been. Near the final stretch, with the shore finally visible ahead, she felt the old urge return once more, the temptation to abandon the float entirely and sprint the rest of the way, certain that being so close meant she no longer needed to rest. She caught herself just before giving in, remembering the calm voice from the boat. "I almost forgot again," she called out, half laughing at herself even through her exhaustion. "Most swimmers do near the end," the older woman called back. "The shore makes everyone forget what got them this far in the first place." She floated once more, briefly, even within sight of the sand, before finishing her crossing at her own steady pace. Afterward, sitting wrapped in a blanket on the sand, she asked the older woman how she had known so calmly that floating would not cost the distance already gained. "Because the channel has taught me that lesson more than once," the older woman said. "Every long crossing eventually asks you to trust something you cannot control completely. The water will hold you if you let it. The only real danger is refusing to ever find out." "Will I need to remind myself of this again on the next crossing?" the young swimmer asked. "Almost certainly," the older woman said, smiling. "The panic that tells you to keep stroking no matter what does not disappear simply because you proved it wrong once. It tends to return at the exact moment your arms grow tired again, whispering that this time really is different." "That sounds discouraging," the young swimmer said. "It is only discouraging if you expect to never feel it again," the older woman said. "Expect it instead, the way you expect the tide to turn. When it comes, you will know now what to do with it. You float. You let the water do what it has always been willing to do." The young swimmer thought of this for a long while, watching the waves roll gently against the sand and found that she no longer feared her next long crossing quite the way she had feared this one. In Polynesian wayfinding traditions, there is a similar understanding of trust in forces larger than the navigator's own constant effort. Traditional Polynesian navigators crossed vast stretches of open ocean not by paddling constantly, but by reading the swells, the stars, the flight patterns of birds, and trusting the canoe and the currents to carry them much of the way. Skill lay as much in knowing when to let the ocean do its part as in any active steering. Wayfinding tradition also emphasizes patience across long voyages, understanding that a crossing unfolds over days and cannot be rushed by sheer paddling effort alone. The navigator's trust in the swell, like the swimmer's trust in the float, reflects this same deep respect for forces that hold you if you allow them to. Polynesian navigators also passed down songs and chants meant to be returned to throughout a long voyage, not memorized once and forgotten, but sung again and again as a way of staying anchored to a method larger than any single moment of fatigue or fear. You may recognize something of that young swimmer's panic in your own resistance to letting anything carry you, certain that only your own constant effort can keep you from being swept somewhere you do not want to go. Perhaps you refuse to ask for help on a difficult project, certain that floating, even briefly, on someone else's support means losing ground you cannot afford to lose. Perhaps you push through exhaustion at work or at home, never letting yourself simply rest on what is already steady around you. Consider tonight that floating is not the failure of your effort. It is the rest your effort depends on to continue at all. You may notice the old panic returning even after you have trusted the float before, certain this time the water will not hold. That panic is common, and it loosens its grip a little more each time you choose to float anyway. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it. The way the young swimmer finally felt the water holding her, unasked, the moment she stopped fighting it. And as you lie here now, let yourself float fully on whatever is steady beneath you tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A room that is never aired, never emptied, never allowed to sit quiet between guests, grows stale no matter how often it is swept. Some kinds of cleanliness require closing the door, not just sweeping the floor. In Taoist thought, Yang is the bustling inn, full of guests, noise, and constant motion. Yin is the closed door, the emptied room, the quiet hours when nothing happens at all, so that everything can be made ready again. An inn needs both to remain truly welcoming. A room that has never been allowed to sit empty carries every guest who passed through it, faintly, in its air. Only the closed door and the quiet hours behind it ever fully clear that air again. We often equate constant availability with generosity, believing that any closed door represents a failure of care toward whoever might need us. A keeper who never closes her doors eventually offers only the appearance of hospitality, worn thin by rooms that never had the chance to properly rest. Tonight's teaching turns toward that closed door, not as a refusal of guests, but as the thing that makes true welcome possible. There was an innkeeper known throughout the region for never once turning away a traveller, proud that her doors had not closed even for an hour in all the years she had run her inn. She believed that closing her doors, even briefly to clean and air the rooms properly, would cost her custom she could never win back, and so she kept every room in constant use, hurrying each departing guest's bedding into a quick wash before the next traveller arrived, never once leaving a room fully empty and aired. For a long while, her inn thrived on its reputation for always having room, and travellers came from far away simply because they knew her doors would never be shut to them. But slowly, complaints began to surface. Guests mentioned a staleness in the rooms, a heaviness in the air that no amount of quick sweeping seemed to lift. Bedding, washed in haste, never quite lost a faint mustiness. Word spread quietly at first that her inn, while always open, no longer felt as fresh as it once had. A travelling merchant, a long-time regular, mentioned this to her directly one evening, gently. "Your rooms used to feel different," he said, "lighter somehow. I cannot explain it better than that." The innkeeper bristled at first. "I have never closed my doors to you, not once in all these years." "I know," the merchant said, "and I am grateful. But tell me, when do your rooms simply sit empty, windows open, with nothing happening in them at all? What made you notice the difference when so many others have not said anything?" the innkeeper asked him. "I have stayed at inns my whole life as part of my trade," the merchant said. "I have learned to notice the small things that separate a place that merely functions from a place that truly restores you. Your rooms used to do the second. Lately they have only managed the first." "I am surprised you noticed at all," the innkeeper admitted. "Most travellers seem grateful simply to have a bed." "Most are," the merchant agreed, "but gratitude for a bed and true rest are not quite the same thing. I have learned to tell the difference, even when I cannot always explain it." She thought about this and realized, troubled, that she could not remember the last time any room had sat entirely empty for more than the brief minutes between one guest's departure and the next guest's arrival. "Never," she admitted. "I cannot afford empty rooms. Empty rooms earn nothing." "And yet," the merchant said gently, "your rooms have begun to feel as though they are earning less, not more, because something about them feels worn down in a way fresh sheets alone cannot fix." The innkeeper considered this for a long while after he had gone to bed. She walked through her inn that night, noticing for the first time in years the faint staleness the merchant had mentioned, present in nearly every room she entered. The next morning she sought out an older innkeeper from a neighbouring town, whose establishment, though smaller, was known for its remarkably fresh, light rooms. "How often do you close your rooms entirely?" she asked. "Each room sits empty and aired for a full day, at least once every week," the older woman said. "Windows open, bedding removed entirely, not just changed. The room simply rests, breathing the outside air, with no one in it at all." "But surely that costs you guests," the innkeeper said. "A whole day, lost, for every room, every week." "It costs me far less than you might think," the older woman said. "Travellers notice freshness more than they notice availability. I have never once heard a guest complain that my inn was occasionally full because a room was resting. I have heard many guests praise how light my rooms feel compared to others. The innkeeper returned home unsettled, turning the conversation over for days before she could bring herself to act on it. Closing even one room felt, to her, like a small failure, a crack in the reputation she had built so carefully. But she finally chose, with great reluctance, to close a single room for one full day, stripping it bare, opening its window to the air, leaving it entirely empty and untouched. She did not yet know whether it would change anything meaningful, but walking past that quiet, open-windowed room during its rest, she found herself oddly comforted by its stillness, as though the room itself, and perhaps something in her too, had finally been allowed to breathe. When a guest mentioned, unprompted, that the air in his room had felt unusually fresh that evening, the innkeeper said nothing, but she smiled to herself long after he had gone up to sleep, feeling something settle in her that had been tense for longer than she had noticed. Within a month, she had begun closing each room for a full day on a rotating schedule, and travellers soon began remarking, unprompted, on how fresh her rooms felt compared to before. Word of this spread the same way her old reputation for never closing once had, though this time the praise was for something she could not see happening, only trust was happening. A new keeper, just starting her own small inn nearby, came to ask her advice, much as the merchant had once gently challenged her. "I'm afraid to close any room," the new keeper admitted. "I worry I will lose guests the moment I do." "I worried the same thing," the older innkeeper said. "I still feel a flicker of it, honestly, every time I close a door for its rest. The fear does not disappear. You simply stop letting it decide for you. How do you know it is worth the risk? Walk past a room mid-rest sometime," the older innkeeper said. "Notice how it feels different from a room being constantly used. Once you feel that difference yourself, the fear loses some of its hold on you, even if it never lets go completely." In Aboriginal Australian tradition, there is a similar understanding of land and place needing rest, often expressed through practices of seasonal care embedded in songlines and ceremonial life. Certain areas of land were traditionally left undisturbed for periods of time, allowed to recover and renew before being used again for hunting, gathering, or ceremony. This rotation was not considered wasted land. It was considered essential care, woven into the deeper understanding of how country sustains those who depend on it. Aboriginal teaching also speaks of ceremony itself needing its proper season, never forced or rushed simply because it might be convenient to perform it sooner. The innkeeper's empty resting room echoes this same patient respect for places needing their own quiet time before they can hold life well again. This understanding extends to storytelling and knowledge sharing as well, where certain teachings are only passed on during specific seasons or gatherings, honoring the idea that wisdom, like land, has its own proper rhythm of use and rest. You may recognize something of that innkeeper's fear in your own resistance to closing any door in your life, even briefly, certain that any pause in availability will cost you something you cannot recover. Perhaps you never let a room in your home or a project at work simply sit unused and reset, filling every space immediately out of fear of appearing idle. Perhaps you keep yourself constantly available to others, never closing your own door long enough to air out whatever has grown stale in you. Consider tonight that closing a door, even briefly, is not a failure of generosity. It is what lets your generosity remain genuinely fresh. You may still feel a flicker of guilt at the thought of being unavailable. Even knowing this, that flicker is common, and it tends to ease gradually every time you close the door anyway and find that nothing important was lost. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it, the way the innkeeper finally felt the stillness of her resting room as something closer to comfort than loss. And as you lie here now, let this be your closed door, your aired room, your permission to simply rest before anyone else needs you again. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A loom kept always threaded, always mid-cloth, never given a quiet stretch between finished bolts, eventually produces cloth that feels rushed, uneven, lacking the care a finished piece deserves. In Taoist thought, yang is the weaving itself, the shuttle's constant motion, thread becoming cloth beneath busy hands. Yin is the idle loom, the pause between bolts, when nothing is being woven and the weaver simply considers what comes next. Cloth depends on both stages, not only the visible one. We often equate constant production with mastery, mistaking a loom that never stops for a loom that is being used well. A weaver who fears an idle loom often produces more cloth, but cloth that says less. Tonight's teaching turns toward that idle loom, the quiet stretch where the next piece is actually decided. There was a weaver renowned in her village for the sheer volume of cloth she produced, her loom rarely still from sunrise until well past dark. She believed deeply that an idle loom was wasted potential, and so the moment one bolt of cloth came free, she threaded the next immediately, without pause, without ever stepping back to consider what she actually wanted the next piece to become. Her cloth sold well enough, sturdy and serviceable, and she took pride in how much more she produced than any other weaver in the region. One season, a buyer from a distant city came through the village seeking cloth of particular distinction for a wealthy patron's commission. He examined the young weaver's abundant stock with interest, but ultimately chose, instead, the far smaller selection from an older weaver who lived at the edge of the village, whose loom, the young weaver had often noticed, sat empty for days at a stretch between pieces. Stung, the young weaver visited the older woman, curious despite her pride. "Your loom sits idle so often," she said, not quite hiding her bewilderment. "And yet the buyer chose your cloth over mine, though I produce 3 times what you do." The older weaver smiled and gestured for her to sit. "Tell me," she said, "when your last bolt came free from the loom, what did you think about before threading the next one?" The young weaver considered this. "Nothing, really. I simply threaded the next piece immediately. There did not seem to be anything to think about. And when you finished weaving it, did you know before you began exactly what pattern you wanted, exactly what story the cloth would tell? The young weaver admitted that she usually decided as she went, adjusting pattern and colour in the moment rather than planning beforehand. "There is no time to plan," she said. "If my loom sits empty, I am not weaving, and if I am not weaving, I am not earning." "My loom sits empty," the older weaver said, "because that is when I actually decide what the cloth should become. I sit with the empty loom for days sometimes, simply imagining the pattern, turning it over, changing my mind, before I ever thread a single strand. By the time I begin weaving, the whole piece already exists clearly in my mind. The loom's idle time is not separate from the weaving. It is the part of the weaving that happens before the hands ever move." "Were you always so patient with your own loom?" the young weaver asked, somewhat doubtfully. "Not at first," the older woman admitted. "In my early years I wove constantly, the same as you, certain that an idle loom meant I had nothing to offer. It took many ordinary forgettable bolts of cloth before I understood that my best work only ever came after I had let myself simply sit and imagine first." "How did you finally let yourself stop the first time without panicking?" "I did panic," the older weaver admitted, smiling faintly. "The first idle week felt unbearable, but I forced myself through it once simply to see what would happen, and the cloth that came after was unlike anything I had made before. That was enough proof to try it again." The young weaver frowned, turning this over. "But that idle time produces no cloth at all." "It produces the cloth that matters," the older weaver said. "Your loom never stops, and so your cloth never has the benefit of a mind that has fully decided what it should be before the hands begin guessing. You weave quickly, but you also weave without a clear destination, adjusting as you go, because you never gave yourself the stillness to know in advance." "I always believed an idle loom was a kind of failure," the young weaver admitted. "Something to be ashamed of if anyone saw it." "It is the opposite," the older weaver said. "An idle loom used well is where the weaver actually becomes a weaver rather than simply a pair of busy hands. The weaving itself is yang, visible, active, easily admired. The idle stretch is yin, quiet, unseen, and just as essential to what the cloth becomes." The young weaver asked, somewhat hesitantly, whether she ought to let her own loom sit idle for a time, despite how strange and wasteful it would feel. "Try it once," the older weaver said. "Let your loom sit empty for several days. Do not rush to fill it. Simply imagine fully what you actually want to weave next, before you weave a single thread of it." The young weaver returned home, and for the first time she could remember, left her loom empty for nearly a week, resisting the urge to thread it immediately. The emptiness unsettled her at first, a visible reminder she felt of lost earnings. But by the week's end she found she had imagined, clearly and completely, a pattern unlike anything she had woven before, one she could not have rushed her way into had her hands never been still long enough to let her mind finish its own quiet work. Months later, with several large orders waiting, the young weaver felt the old panic return, the urge to thread the loom immediately after each finished bolt, without pausing to imagine what should come next. She visited the older weaver again, troubled by how easily the old habit had crept back. "I thought I had learned this," she said, "but the moment the orders piled up, I went right back to filling the loom without thinking." "That does not surprise me," the older weaver said. "Pressure has a way of pulling us back toward our oldest habits, even the ones we know do not serve us. The idle loom asks for trust precisely when trust feels hardest to give." "How do you manage it, with all the orders you must fill?" "I plan my idle stretches the same way I plan my weaving," the older weaver said. "Not as something I do if there happens to be time, but as something the cloth genuinely requires, the same as thread or dye. The orders wait. They always have." The young weaver began, after that, scheduling her idle stretches deliberately, rather than hoping they would simply appear, and found, over the following season, that her cloth had begun to draw the kind of attention her abundant production never had. A buyer who had once passed her over entirely returned that season, drawn by word of a particular bolt she had imagined during one of her longest idle stretches. He asked her, admiring the pattern, how long it had taken her to weave. "Only a few days at the loom," she told him, "but far longer than that, sitting beside an empty one." He looked at her, puzzled, until she explained, and then he simply nodded, as though something about the cloth made more sense to him now than it had a moment before. In Mayan cosmology, there is a similar understanding of cyclical time, in which periods of activity and periods of quiet gestation are equally tracked and honored within the calendar itself. The Mayan calendar systems divided time into cycles that included periods understood as more dormant or reflective, alongside periods of active ceremony and labor, treating both as essential rhythms rather than one being merely an absence of the other. Time itself was never imagined as a single, unbroken push forward. Mayan agricultural tradition also honored fallow periods for the land, much like the weaver's idle loom, trusting that a field left to rest was preparing itself for a richer planting later, rather than simply producing nothing in the meantime. Mayan weaving traditions themselves, still practiced today, often involve long periods of pattern conception before a single thread is set on the loom, treating that conceptual stage as inseparable from the weaving itself, rather than a delay before the real work begins. You may recognize something of that young weaver's restless productivity in your own resistance to letting any part of your life sit idle, certain that stillness anywhere represents lost ground. Perhaps you immediately fill any free evening with a new task the moment one project ends, never allowing yourself the quiet stretch to decide what you actually want next. Perhaps you judge an empty calendar as failure rather than as the space your clearest thinking might actually need. Consider tonight that the idle stretches in your life are not separate from what you are building. They are where you actually decide what it should become. You may feel the old pull to fill every space the moment pressure returns, even after proving to yourself that idle time serves you well. That pull is common, and it loosens its grip a little more each time you choose the pause anyway. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it. The way the young weaver finally felt her own clearest pattern emerge only after her hands had stopped. And as you lie here now, Let this be your idle loom, your quiet stretch, your mind finally free to imagine nothing at all. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A flame kept burning every moment, never once allowed to go dark and cool, eventually burns through whatever fuel sustains it, far faster than a flame lit only when needed. In Taoist thought, Yang is the burning torch, bright and visible against the dark. Yin is the unlit torch, resting, its fuel preserved, ready for the moment it is truly needed. A wise bearer trusts the unlit torch as much as the lit one. We often imagine the most devoted guardian of light as the one who never lets it go out, treating any darkness on his watch as a failure of his service. The dark is not the failure of the flame, it is the condition that makes the flame meaningful when it finally appears. Tonight's teaching, our last, turns toward that necessary dark, the place where light finds its true value. There was a torchbearer responsible for lighting the way through a long mountain passage used by travelers crossing between two distant villages, and he had grown convinced that his torch should never be allowed to go out, not even briefly, certain that any darkness along his post reflected poorly on his diligence. He kept his torch burning continuously, day and night, refusing to let it rest even during the long hours when no travelers passed through the passage at all. He took pride in this, believing that an ever-burning torch proved his unwavering devotion to the safety of anyone who might need it. But his supply of oil and pitch dwindled far faster than he had planned for, and one night, deep into a season when travelers had grown scarce due to weather, his torch finally sputtered and died from sheer exhaustion of fuel, leaving the passage dark just as an unexpected group of travelers arrived, caught entirely without light. No serious harm came of it, though the travelers stumbled badly in the dark before finding their way. But the torchbearer was deeply shaken, and he sought out an old keeper of a similar passage in a neighboring range, someone known for never once failing a traveler in need of light. "My torch burned constantly," he said, "and still it failed at the very moment it was needed most." The old keeper considered him for a while. "How long has your torch burned without rest?" "Every night, every day, without pause," the torchbearer said. "I never let it go dark, not even for a single hour." "Did you keep your own flame burning constantly when you first took up this work?" the torchbearer asked. "For several seasons," the old keeper admitted. "I believed, as you did, that a flame allowed to die was a flame that had failed its purpose. It took running short of fuel during my own difficult winter, much as happened to you, before I trusted the dark hours at all." "Why?" the old keeper asked simply. "Because I believed a dark passage, even briefly, was a failure," the torchbearer said. "I thought a constantly burning torch was the only proof that I took my duty seriously." The old keeper shook his head slowly. "My torch rests far more than it burns," he said. "It is unlit through most of every day, through most of every quiet night when no one travels the passage at all." "And yet you have never failed a traveler?" the torchbearer said, somewhat bewildered. How is that possible if your torch spends so much of its time unlit? Because the torch that rests has fuel left for the night it is truly needed, the old keeper said. Your torch burned constantly, and so it had nothing left when an actual traveler appeared in the dark. Mine rests constantly, and so it always has everything left when someone actually needs its light. The torchbearer turned this over, troubled. But how do you know when to light it? Surely a traveler could arrive at any moment, even during the quiet hours. I listen for the passage, the old keeper said. I watch for the signs of someone approaching, distant voices, the sound of footsteps on stone. The dark hours when no one is coming are not failures of my watch. They are the rest that makes my watch reliable when it actually matters. I thought the flame itself was the proof of devotion, the torchbearer said slowly. Not the watching. The flame is only useful when someone needs it, the old keeper said. A flame burning uselessly through an empty passage with no traveler in sight is not devotion. It is waste dressed up to look like diligence. True devotion is having the flame ready, fully fueled, the moment it is genuinely needed, not exhausting it on hours when it serves no one at all. The torchbearer thought of the night his own torch had failed, the very night it had finally been called upon after months spent burning for no one. I spent everything I had on darkness no one needed lit, he said quietly, and had nothing left for the dark that mattered. That is the lesson most torchbearers learn only once, the old keeper said, not unkindly. The flame and the dark are not enemies. The dark is where the flame's fuel is saved. The flame is simply what the dark becomes, briefly, when it is truly called for. Did anyone ever doubt you for keeping your torch unlit so often? The torchbearer asked. Often in my early years, the keeper said. Travelers sometimes complained arriving to a dark passage instead of a welcoming flame. But not once in all these years has a traveler arrived to find me unprepared when it actually mattered. That is the only measure I have ever cared to answer to. The torchbearer returned to his own passage and, for the first time, let his torch go fully dark through the quiet hours, trusting his ears and his watchfulness rather than his fire to carry him through the silence. It troubled him at first, sitting in darkness that had once felt to him like neglect. But slowly, listening to the wind move through the empty passage, he began to understand that the unlit torch beside him was not idle at all. It was simply waiting, fully ready for the one moment that would actually need it. Some weeks later, a sudden storm sent a group of travelers scrambling for shelter in the passage well after dark, and the torchbearer, hearing their distant voices through the wind, lit his torch at the precise moment they needed it most, the flame catching instantly, bright and full, fed by all the fuel his quiet hours had preserved. The travellers thanked him warmly afterward, remarking on how quickly the light had appeared, as though he had been waiting for them all along. "In a way I was," he told them, smiling. Later, alone again in the dark passage, he found himself thinking of the old keeper's words, turning them over freely now rather than resisting them. The dark no longer felt to him like neglect of his duty. It felt like the quiet half of it, the half that made the lit half mean something when it mattered. He had asked the keeper before leaving whether the old fear of an unlit torch ever returned. "Often," she had admitted, "I have only learned slowly to trust the dark a little more than I trust the fear. The torchbearer carried that thought with him through every quiet, unlit night that followed. In Norse mythology, there is a similar understanding of light and dark as a necessary cycle rather than a battle to be won outright. The Norse imagined day and night as figures pulled across the sky in endless rotation, neither one ever permanently defeating the other, each simply giving way when its turn had passed. The long dark of winter was understood as essential preparation, not failure, for the eventual return of light. Norse wisdom literature, including the Havamal, also counsels moderation and rest, warning against burning too brightly without pause, since even the strongest flame, kept lit without rest, eventually exhausts itself before the moment that truly calls for its strength. The Norse also told of Yggdrasil, the great tree whose roots and branches existed in constant exchange between worlds, drawing and releasing in turn, never demanding that one half of its existence overpower the other. You may recognize something of that torchbearer's exhausted flame in your own habit of staying lit for everyone all the time, certain that any unlit hour reflects carelessness rather than wisdom. Perhaps you answer every request immediately, day or night, never letting yourself go dark and quiet, even when no one truly needs you in that moment. Perhaps you keep yourself burning through ordinary days that ask nothing urgent of you, leaving nothing left for the nights that genuinely do. Consider tonight that your own rest, your own unlit hours, are not a failure of devotion to anyone who depends on you. They are what makes your light reliable when it is truly needed. You may still feel the old urge to stay lit for everyone, out of habit alone, even on nights when nothing actually calls for it. That urge visits often. It does not have to be obeyed. You do not need to understand this fully tonight. Only feel it, the way the torchbearer finally felt the quiet of his own unlit passage as readiness rather than neglect. And as you lie here now, let your own flame go fully, peacefully dark, resting completely until morning calls for it again. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight we began with the dance of stillness and movement, yin and yang. And over these 13 chapters, we let that question open, slowly from many different sides. We met a falconer who learned his hawk needed full rest. Not only flight, a drummer who discovered silence gives the beat its shape. A dancer who found her stillness was what audiences remembered longest. A singer who learned her breath between phrases kept her voice alive. A vineyard keeper who let his vines finally sleep through winter. A watchman who nearly failed from refusing sleep and learned to trust another's watch. A runner who found his stride only after he allowed himself to walk. A baker who discovered the quiet rise inside dough she could not see. An instrument maker who learned wood needs years of stillness before it can hold a true shape. A swimmer who survived by finally floating. an innkeeper who found freshness only behind a closed door, a weaver whose idle loom held her clearest patterns, and a torchbearer who learned the unlit hours were what kept his flame ready for the night that truly needed it. We are not machines that must run without pause. We are not measured, in the end, by how much we resisted rest. We are not failures for needing a season of quiet. We are not weaker for letting something else carry us for a while. We are rhythms. We are rest and motion, taking turns. We are the bright stroke and the long float beside it. We are the lit torch and the necessary dark that lets it mean something. We are, each of us, both halves of the same turning circle, neither half ever truly finished without the other. The central teaching beneath everything tonight is this: nothing moves well for long without also resting well. The night is not the interruption of the day, it is the day's other necessary half, the half that makes the next morning possible at all. We so often treat rest as the thing we earn only after everything else is finished, as though it were a reward rather than a requirement. But the falconer's hawk, the dancer's pause, the vineyard's bare winter, the torch's unlit hour, none of them waited to be earned. They were simply what made the rest of the story possible at all. Tonight asks you to consider that your own rest might belong to that same quiet category, not a reward you have not yet deserved, but a need as basic and as legitimate as breath. This is not a teaching you master once and then carry forward, finished, into the rest of your life. It is a teaching you return to again and again, every time you forget it, every time the old fear creeps back that rest is somehow theft from your own potential. You will likely need to hear this many more times, in many more nights, and that is not failure. That is simply how this particular wisdom works. It does not stay learned, it asks gently to be remembered. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. If one moment stayed with you, one phrase, one feeling, let that be enough. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here, exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready to set down. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night.